Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today we've got a really fun project. We're going to be turning a Lego-inspired style head with some different fun accessories that are a really fun gift and they're easy to make. The great thing about this project is all the head pieces or the accessories are interchangeable, so if you want some cool hair that looks like burl, you can swap that out, or if you want to turn something cool like a little miner's hat or a helmet, the nice thing is they all just fit on because we're going off the same dimensions on all the heads, and we'll cover the dimensions in depth and detail as we're turning the project. That way you can make sure that your piece is going to be the exact same and you have interchangeability amongst the different parts. The great thing about this project is it's easy to do, but they're super popular, and the nice thing is there's no limit to what you can do with the accessories. You can change the heads up if you want to, but you can do so many different hats and accessories. Like I've got a little miner's hat here, we've got a cool helmet with some figured maple, we've got a bowler hat, a nice little fedora, Indiana Jones inspired style looking guy, and then if you had some burl, you can do some hair to dress up your different pieces. So really fun project. Let's get to the lathe and get started. Alright, so now that we're at the lathe, let's talk about blank selection for just a minute. Because we are going to be spray painting this piece yellow, we don't have to have high figured or really nice wood. So I've just got a piece of maple. This is 3x3 by, at a minimum you want is 4 inches long. But this is going to be a little bit longer. We can use that extra piece as a jam chuck later on. So 3x3x4 minimum for the head, and then whatever hat you're turning or whatever accessory, I've got just a piece of walnut here we're going to be turning a miner's hat with. So change your blank selection depending on if you want this to be a natural figured piece of maple, figured material, or if you want to change the hat style. So just playing around with different materials. But we've got that 3x3 by roughly 5 inches here, and I've got my centers marked. That way we can mount this right on the right between our centers here, and I do have my safety drive mounted in my chuck. So let's get this mounted up. And because our dimension is going to be as close as we can get to that 3 inches, we're not going to be removing a lot of material. We just want to get this blank round. The finished outside diameter of this is roughly basically 2 3/4 to 2 7/8, as close as you can get. So we want to make sure that this blank is mounted as true as possible. Once we have our tailstock secure, everything's nice and tight, let's get our tool rest set up. And for the initial turning, we want to use our spindle roughing gouge to get this fairly close to round and turn a tenon on this so we can mount it into our chuck. So adjust your tool rest height depending on whatever tool you're using. We'll be starting out with the spindle roughing gouge. I've got this right at about center with my cutting edge, and we want to make sure that spins free and clear. For our roughing speed, we're going to be about 2,000 RPM. We're just going to be knocking these corners off nice and easy. Make sure you take nice controlled cuts and you have appropriate safety gear. Safety glasses, dust mask, respirator, dust collection. So let's get our lathe started. We want to make sure we start this with the lathe at 0, and then we'll slowly bring this up to speed. That way you can check if there's any issues with the way you have your piece mounted. That way you can stop it before it's going too fast. Alright, got the tool on the rest, about 1 o'clock flute position, and we can just start eating the corners off. That safety drive, if it starts slipping, just tighten up that tailstock a little bit. The nice thing about the safety drive is if you do have a catch, it's going to spin free instead of throwing the piece off the lathe at you. Again, that flute's at about the 1 o'clock position, and we're working downhill. Once we get close to this end of the chuck side, we're going to flip this over to about the 11 o'clock and go towards our chuck. And it looks like I need to move my tool rest over just a hair. I don't want my tool sliding off the tool rest during a cut. We'll pick that back up again. And I want to be careful here with my chuck jaws. And I don't need this to be perfectly round at this point. We just want to get those sharp corners off and out of the way. And we're going to cut our tenon right here. The reason we don't want to get to our perfect round diameter right now is because once we drill this with the Forstner bit and we remount it on our pin jaws, it might be slightly out of true and you'll have to remove more material to true that up. So we'll just do that once it's remounted on our pin jaws later on. So now let's cut our tenon for our chuck jaws. We'll be using a skew and doing a peeling cut. And now that we have this close to round, we can bump up that speed just a bit. We're about 2200 RPM. And I've got the handle nice and low, and then we're going to just slightly raise that handle to do a peeling cut. All right, and that's going to be perfect. Let's go ahead and throw that in our chuck and make sure it fits. The nice thing about mounting your drive center in your chuck jaws is that way I don't have to grab my knockout bar and then throw my chuck on again. I can just keep my chuck on the lathe and it reduces your downtime, especially if you're trying to turn a lot of these at a time. All right, that fits that chuck jaw really well. All right, so now I'm gonna get this a little bit closer to round and then we can lay out our dimensions, but let's cover the dimensions of the head that I have here. So I've turned all the other ones as samples at the same size, and it's 3 1/4 inches long and it's 2 3/4 inches diameter. And that's for the main body. As far as the little step on the top goes, it's 3/16 of an inch tall by 1 15/16 diameter. Good, because we will be using a 2-inch Forstner bit to drill out for our hat. So I went 1 15/16 on this. That way, if the wood moves, there's still enough give for that to fit all the different heads. And then on this is a 1/4 inch long on the bottom here by 2 7/16. So those are our dimensions. We'll have a little drawing with all the dimensions on there. That way you can follow along and make yours the same size. But let's get this a little bit closer to round and we'll clean up this end here and we'll start laying out our dimensions. That way we can try and turn to our same size. So same thing, we're back at the 1 o'clock position with our flute. All right, just get that a little bit closer. We'll do a peel cut here just to clean up the end just a little bit and get that prepped for our Forstner bit. We want to make sure that this surface is nice and flat because as that Forstner bit goes to drill in, if it's crooked at all, it's going to engage the Forstner bit just on one side and it's going to start shaking the piece, or it could have a catch and throw this out of the lathe. All right, and before we go to our Forstner bit, I just want to clean up that surface here on the end. And I want to take fairly light cuts because this piece is sticking out of the chuck jaws quite a way. It's unsupported. You can hear that little bit of vibration. I just want to clean up any of the tear out we had from that peel cut. And I want to make sure that this surface is nice and flat. I'll get my skew, just create a little bit of a dimple for that Forstner bit to help center off of. Alright, we should have a pretty clean surface. That bevel riding cut with the spindle gouge, that's left us a super clean surface, so we're good with that. Let's get our banjo out of the way, we'll slide that over, and we can remove our revolving center. The next step of our process is going to be using an 1.5 inch Forstner bit to drill out the majority of the head here. That's going to lighten that up, and that's going to give us a way to remount and turn the outside of this piece. So we'll mount our Forstner bit in a keyless chuck. And as far as the drilling depth, it really doesn't matter how far you go. I'm going to go basically until the end of the Forstner bit shaft right here. That's going to give me enough length for my pin jaws to get inside the head and expand and hold that piece. If you were using a jam chuck, you could go, a lot shorter if you needed to. But we're also trying to remove some weight from this as well, so it's not super heavy. So I'm going to drill basically to the end of the shaft right here. And what I want to do is I'm going to turn this on nice and really slow with my tailstock loose, and I'll bring that center up until it's engaged. And then I'll lock it down, and then we can bump up our speed. That's going to help that bit center a little more accurately as well. As far as our drilling speed, we want to be right at about 500 RPM. And just nice and slow, advance the bit. Make sure you back it out occasionally, clear out any shavings. If you're working with a really dull Forstner bit, you'll know because it'll start smoking. Okay, we're right there at the end of the shaft. And because we're running in a Morse taper, I always like to pull on my drill chuck back as I'm retracting it, just in case it's not seated as tight as it needs to be. Sometimes you can be pulling that out and there's enough friction on the head of the Forstner bit that'll actually unseat your Morse taper and it could get loose in there and cause a problem. So I always like to pull back on that as I'm retracting the tailstock. And we can remove our drill bit and keyless chuck from the tailstock. And if you want to, you could get a box scraper and clean that up just so it's a little nicer presentation if people pick it up. That way it doesn't look as bad. If you got a box scraper, you could clean this up and make those look a little bit nicer, or you could sand it as well. So, next step of our process is let's lay this out. That way we can have a visual reference of where we need to turn to, and we can start establishing our diameters as well. One of the other things we want to do before we flip this around in our pin jaws is we do want to get this bottom radius turned and this cleaned up and sanded, as well as this bottom step, because once we're in our pin jaws, we'll be seated up right against the chuck face, and I don't want to be getting my tools that close to the jaws. So if you have a 60-degree cone center, you can bring that up and still center in that drilled hole. That way you do have a little bit of support. Get my tool rest height set back up. And let's start by establishing our diameter of this step here. So this was, I want to say 2 7/16. I'm going to grab a set of calipers and just set that, and then we can check quickly on the fly. Okay, so we're going to set our calipers just so that it slips over that turn diameter, and that's going to be perfect. That way we can check this quickly on the fly, and then we're getting repeatable dimensions. That way when you go to get all these different parts and pieces, they all fit and match together. So we'll be using the skew as a peel cut to turn that smaller step. That'll be fine. And I'm looking for roughly a 1/4 inch long on that bottom tenon. Okay, I've got about just over 1/8 of an inch of material to remove. Okay, that's just about to slip over. I'm going to bump up the speed on this last cut. That way I make sure I get a really clean cut on this side grain here. And that should fit over nice. Perfect. Now that we have that clean, I want to get this end grain here cleaned up because that peeling cut leaves that a little rough. So I'll get my skew. And we're just going to slice through those fibers. And that leaves us a really clean surface behind. Now I can get this pretty much close to round. Just here on the very end. Because we are going to be turning that 1/4 bead here on the bottom right now. Okay, we're running round, and now I'm looking for just a 1/4 round radius on that bottom. We're going to round this over, so we'll be using the spindle gouge. This is a 3/8, starting on that bevel. The flute's at 12 o'clock basically, and then I start rolling that over, and that's going to give us a really nice looking bead, or 1/4 bead I guess. I'm going to pick that up. I'm going to start on that bevel and just pick this cut up a little bit. And I've got a little bit of fuzzy fiber right here down in the corner. Just going to clean that up. Okay, you can see how burnished that is from the heel of the tool. That's cut nice and clean. There's no tear out. We've got our dimension for that bottom piece as well as our bead, so I'm happy with that. At this point, we want to sand these exposed areas we just turned, because once we flip this around in our pin jaws, we won't really be able to access these anymore. So I'm going to be moving my revolving center, move my tool rest out of the way, and we'll turn this down to about 600-700 RPM. Start out with some 180. And because we cut this nice and clean, there shouldn't be a lot of sanding work to do. Just smoothing out that bead if there's any imperfections. I just want to check and make sure the bottom of this is slightly concave. Yep, we should be good. I do want to make sure that's concave, that way it doesn't rock on a table once you set it down. All right, now we can go to that 240 grit, 220, 240. All right, now we can go on to our 320. I'm going to stop at 320 because we are spray painting this. It doesn't need to be sanded any finer than that. Okay. All right, we're done sanding the bottom of that. All right, and the last thing I want to do is just get some sanding sealer and just coat this surface. That way I can buff it dry on the lathe while I still have access to this area. The sanding sealer is going to give us a better prepped surface for our spray paint as well. Usually when you spray paint straight onto raw wood, it absorbs too much in certain areas, like the end grain fibers. So I want to give this just a nice consistent base layer for that spray paint to adhere to. So sanding sealer is a great way to do that. And once you put it on there, it'll penetrate down into the fibers, and then we can just buff this dry. Okay, really good surface right here, no tear out, nice cut clean. I'm happy with that radius, and our dimensions, they all match the head we have here. So now we can take this out of our chuck, and we'll take our VM120 off the lathe, and we'll throw on our 100 with the pin jaws. All right, so here I've got my VM100 with the extended pin jaws. This is probably one of my most used sets of jaws that I've got. It eliminates the need for jam chucks a lot of the time, especially on smaller spindle projects. But now we can just expand this and seat this on the jaws, and this should run pretty true. Yeah, that's running nice and true. And another thing you can do, I'll show you in just a second. Let's get our tailstock back up, and I'm going to switch to my cup center. That way, if you're working with a shorter piece of material and you don't want to have a lot of damage in those end grain fibers, the cup center is not going to do as much damage as a 60 degree. All right, so now that we have this remounted, I just want to lay out my overall length. That was 3 1/4 inches from the bottom here where the chuck jaws meet the wood to the very top of the head. So I'm going to scribe a pencil line here, and I'm going to part this material away. And the nice thing is if you don't have these chuck jaws, you can part this piece off while it was still mounted in the other chuck, and you can turn a jam chuck out of this scrap piece of material. So because I have a tenon on there already, I'll part this off and just throw that in my jam chuck bin. I've got a bunch of these little pieces that I'll always just remount in a chuck, turn it to whatever project I'm turning that day. So you can always reuse this extra piece of material. So that pencil line is my finished overall length, so I'm going to go 1/4 inch away and give myself just a little extra wood. All right, once we get that down to about a 1/2 inch, I'm just going to get my saw and just cut that off. All right, I'm going to loosen up that tailstock. Reason I'm sawing this instead of parting all the way through is I don't want to damage all the end grain fibers right here, because we are just about 3/16 away from that final diameter of our piece there. So I'm going to keep this, throw this in my extra parts bin, and we can start turning the rest of this piece. I'm going to make sure I'm nice and secure on my expansion. I don't want to go too tight because I could split the piece. It's easy to over torque your jaws and then pop your piece open. So I'm going to get my tailstock out of the way now. And let's get our spindle roughing gouge and get this piece trued up and nice and straight across. I'm just looking to true the surface up and make it as flat across as I can. Okay. Got a nice little knot going through there. That'll be a nice little added decoration. So we've got about 3/16 extra length on here. We can clean up our end here, and let's do our peeling cut to create our top piece. And this one's the really critical one. We want to make sure that this dimension is right on the money, because all of our hats are going to be drilled to the same size, and we want to have interchangeability between the different heads you turn. That way, if you're turning a bunch of these for gifts and stuff, that way they can swap the hats and they all fit the heads. So I've got my caliper set. So let's get our skew and we'll do a peel cut. I'm just going to remove some of this material to get us closer to that overall length. So as far as our peel cut goes, we want to be on that bevel first with that handle really low, and then we'll raise that handle to engage the cut. And it just peels through that side grain fiber so easy. We get these long ribbons, really good cut, and it cuts that side grain really clean. It just doesn't do very well on the end grain. So, all right, we still have a ways to go. We'll just pick up that cut right here. Check it again. Okay, we're getting pretty close. Okay, perfect. That's tight going over, but it slips over nice and fine. So now we want to clean up these surfaces of end grain and get this flat across the top as well. So I'm going to bring my tool rest around just a hair. That way I can get my spindle gouge, do a bevel riding cut. Tool rest is just a touch high for that tool. I'm going to bring it down. And with this, I want to make sure that flute's really closed. I don't want to have a skate. We'll do the same thing here on this surface. And then I'll get my skew just to clean up that corner. All right, now I can start working on the round. Getting that half bead here. And I want it to be the same curvature as the bead on the bottom, that way it is symmetrical. Just a super light cut, nice and controlled. And that'll give us that really clean half round. So it should match up nice with this guy. All right, I've got a little bit more tear out here on this face. It's a little deeper than I thought, so I'm going to recut that. check our surface. Okay, that looks a lot better. Now we can sand this now. So we're gonna be sanding this side here. I wanna be really careful on the sanding right here because I don't want to change the shape of that too much. And then we can be pretty close to being done with the head of the Lego here. Need to drop that speed down. Use the corner of that paper to get down in there in that shoulder. If the paper's slipping, you can fold it over on itself. And then we can go over to our 320. Okay. Now that we've got the surface sanded, let's grab our sanding sealer. And you can see we've got a nice clean top here, no torn grain or anything. Once you hit that torn grain with the spray paint, it shows up really bad. So you want to make sure that you have really clean surfaces and a good sanded, refined, finished surface. Get a dry section of your paper towel, and we're just going to buff dry the surface. You want to make sure that that sanding sealer is dried and cured before you spray paint it. But this will give us a really good base layer for our spray paint to adhere to and not soak in too much on the end grain and lay weird, and it might create some weird looking surface imperfections. So with your finish rags, make sure you lay those things out to dry. That stuff's super flammable. But now we can take that off the chuck. So we've got clean surfaces here on the bottom as well as the bead, top of the face here. This thing's looking really good, and it's nice and consistent with our other heads that we've have turned. So now that we're ready to, now that this is done here, we can take this outside and spray paint it. And this color I found is a really good looking color. This is from Ace Hardware. This is their Sunshine Yellow. I'm really happy with this color of yellow. So I'm going to take this outside and spray paint it, and then we'll be right back to show you what it looks like. Alright, so we've got the head painted, and you can see I've put a light enough coat of the yellow on that we can still see some of the wood grain through. If you didn't want to see any of the wood grain, you could hit it with primer first and then paint it, but I think it's kind of cool to still see the wood texture underneath while having that yellow color. So basically 1.5 coats. This thing's ready to go, so we can set this off to the side. And now we're ready to turn the hat. I'm going to turn kind of a miner's helmet style, and I've got a piece of walnut here. This is roughly 5 inches big in diameter, and then it's about 2 inches thick. So you could go a lot smaller. I'm going to be cutting a fair amount of the material away. But I've got this pre-drilled for my screw chuck. We're going to mount this on here just so we can turn a tenon and put that into our chuck, and then we'll be drilling that hole to fit the head where that screw chuck drill bit hole is. So let's turn our speed down to 0, and I'm going to turn this on as slow as it can go. That way I can just feed this on as it's turning. It's a lot easier to get the piece on that way. And then as it seats, let it take it out of your hand, and then we can turn the lid off and snug it up. Now we can get our tool rest in position. Right now I'm just going to be removing some of this material, cutting our tenon to fit our chuck. So I'll be using a bowl gouge. And I've got a 3/8 bowl gouge here, and this is what we'll be using. So let's go ahead and turn the lathe on, and we can bump this up to about 1500 to 2000 RPM, whatever you feel comfortable with. And we'll just start peeling this away. And we're looking to just remove enough material, that way we can create our tenon. I've got that flute about 10:30, 11 o'clock. All right, I'll bring my tool rest around a little bit. I'm going to be using my spindle gouge now to get that dovetail profile. It's a little bit tighter of a curve, so I'm just gonna get in there with a smaller tool. And then just clean up that shoulder for our chuck jaws. Now we can take this off and remount it into our chuck. All right, we'll get this remounted into our chuck. Make sure this is nice and tight. And what we want to do now is we'll be using a Forstner bit to drill this out. And this is going to give us that consistent opening for the heads. That way they're all interchangeable. So let me get my revolving center out of the way here. And we're going to be done with our spindle roughing gouge, so I'm going to set this off to the side. And we can grab our keyless chuck with that 2-inch bit. Again, we're turning this little stem here on the head to be 1 15/16. So we should be good with a 2-inch bit. We're done with our parting tool, so I'm going to just move some of these tools out of our way. And we can bring up our Forstner bit. And again, drilling speed with the Forstner bit, about 500 RPM. And you can see I drilled that about a 1/2 inch deep, even though this tenon is a little shorter than that. Reason being, I am going to concave this surface, and I want to make sure I've got enough depth on my drilled hole. That way when I do concave this to make that taper underneath the hat, we still have enough shoulder for that to fit onto our head. So now that we have that hole drilled, we can bring our tool rest up into position. And what we're looking to recreate here is basically this concave surface here. That way when it sits on top of the head, it looks nice and it's not sticking proud and you're seeing the corner here. So we want to concave this surface, and then we can flip that around and do the outside of our hat. Before we do the concave on the underside of our rim, I want to get our overall diameter established on our hat. So I'm going to be using my bull gouge just to rough down some material, get this a little bit smaller. The reason for reducing the diameter now is if this is the full size and we flip it around, when I make those cuts to get the diameter down, it's going to peel off these fibers here on the end because they're unsupported and it's going to leave me tear out. So I want to make sure my diameter is established on the underside of our hat and everything's cut cleanly before we flip it around. So I think as far as the diameter of our hat, you can grab your piece, put it on there. I think that's still about maybe a 1/2 inch, 1/4 to a 1/2 inch, still too big in diameter. So I'm going to bring that down just a little bit more. But that's the biggest reason, is I want to make sure my diameter is established. That way I'm not doing unsupported cuts later on that are going to lead to tear out. Let's see how that looks now. Okay, I think that diameter is pretty good. Let's just finish stepping the rest of this wood down. But you can see these unsupported fibers here, they curl over and they tear out. And that's why we didn't want to do this cut later on. Okay, now we can bring our tool rest around and start doing the concave rim. Alright, so to do our undercut rim here, I'm just going to start on my bevel. I've got that flute about 3 o'clock. We're just going to start giving us a nice tapered in. All right. I think we've got enough taper there. Let's check it against the head. I think we could give that just a little bit more taper to it. I think it'll look a little bit better. And we still have plenty of room there on that shoulder to register against the head, so I'm not worried about that. Okay, let's move this out of the way and we can start sanding the underside of the rim. We won't have access to this later on, so we want to make sure that this is sanded and has our sanding sealer on the underside of our rim. All right, we're going to drop our speed back down to about 500 for sanding. And we'll go to our 320. And after we sand, we're going to grab our sanding sealer again. We're not painting the hat, but we will be spray lacquering it. And I want to have a good base level surface for that spray lacquer to adhere to. So we'll grab some sanding sealer. All right, I've got my sanding sealer. We'll put a nice heavy coat on. Yeah, we'll turn the lathe on now and just grab a clean section of rag. And then just buff dry this piece. Okay, that looks good. Clean cut. Now we can flip this around and remount it into our chuck. And we will need to switch back to our pin jaws, our extended pin jaws. These dovetail jaws don't go small enough for that 2-inch hole. If you had a little bit smaller chuck, that would work as well. But we'll go back to our pin jaws here. All right, we'll just check and make sure that's running true. Yeah, that looks good. All right, let's set up our tool rest now to get the shape of our hat. And this is the profile I'm going to be shooting for. So I'm going to start removing that bulk of the material here, starting to get that rounded shape here. We'll incorporate maybe some of this tenon into our overall height. I think this is maybe, yeah, about a 1/4 inch longer than the finished hat, so we'll remove some of this material here. But let's go ahead and get our bull gouge, and we'll start moving material, and we'll bump our speed back up to our 1500 to 2000 RPM. I'm going to start establishing the rim of our hat. Again, we've got that fluid at about 3 o'clock, 2:30, 3 o'clock, riding the bevel, and then I raise the handle as I get to center. I'm going to bring my rest around so I can do a push cut here. And with that push cut, I've got the handle a ways away from my body. Tool rest is still just a touch high. And we can pick up the cut here with that fluid at about 10 o'clock. This will give us a cleaner surface because that fiber is supported. Just going to bring that rest around, give me a little bit better access to the rim of our hat. All right, now that we're getting close to our final shape, I'm gonna start shear scraping with my bowl gouge to refine the surface. So with that shear scrape, I've got that handle nice and low and that flute rolled over all the way. And then to get this here, just to get a better curve, I'm going to use my skew as a negative rake scraper, and then just pass this across the surface, just gliding that and trying to get a nice smooth radius on the top of the hat. That should leave behind a really clean surface as well. That looks really good. All right, now that we've got our hat mostly done, I just want to round over the brim of this hat a little bit more, give it a little bit better radius to it. So I'm just going to lightly smooth this out with my skew. Okay, I'm happy with that. Now we're ready to sand, and then we'll add some detail lines. I don't like to add the detail lines before I sand because usually the sandpaper muddies them and doesn't keep them as crisp. Again, we want to drop that speed down. And the cool thing about the hats and accessories you make for these, if you did some carving or burning and incorporated those elements into the hat, you can make some really, really cool things. And just, there's no limit to what you can make with these. You could do a fireman's helmet, you can do a construction helmet, racing helmet, some cool baseball hats, cowboy hat. There's so many different things you can make for these little guys that just take them to the next level. So if you have a little carver or a burner or something, incorporate that into your design and you can have a lot of fun with this project. We'll go on to our 220 now, or our 240. Yeah, if you get creative with some different dyes, materials, embellishments, or whatever you add to it, it's just going to make it that much cooler. So experiment and play around with some different ideas. We're up onto our 320 now. I think this walnut's going to look really good once we're done with it here. And once we're done sanding, I'm going to use my skew and I'm going to get some nice little decorative detail lines. Just something to take it to the next level. We'll bump up my speed and I'm just using that fine point on my skew just to create a couple small little decorative grooves. Alright, so now we can apply our sanding sealer. The nice thing about the sanding sealer as well is it's going to help prevent whatever final finish you use from darkening the piece too much. Like if I put water locks on top of this, it would make it a really dark walnut, and I don't want that. I want to keep that natural color of the walnut, so we'll be using that spray lacquer, but that sanding sealer helps keep the natural color of the wood, and that way it isn't affected by whatever your top finish is. Now I can just buff dry the hat. Once you buff dry the sanding sealer, we can remove the hat from the lathe. Okay, and I'm really happy with that. So there's our new miner's hat. And one thing we're going to do is I've got a cool little decorative cabochon that'll look like a nice little light on the face of the helmet here. We'll glue that on after we spray lacquer it. All right, so now that we're done with the hat, before we glue on our little decorative cabochon, we will spray lacquer it. So I'll be using the Glue Boost lacquer shot. Obviously you want to wear a respirator or protection and do this outside. I'll throw one coat on here just so you can see how it looks. Then I'll take it outside and finish it up. But the biggest thing is make sure the nozzle's working and then just light coats, 8 to 10 inches away. Obviously you don't want to spray this on your lathe because you'll get everything coated, but just so you can see how it's done. Just light back and forth passes. You don't want to go too heavy with any spray lacquer or spray paint because you'll get runs with it. And then I'll also get underneath the rim of the hat. So I'll let that tack up, then I'll take it outside and we'll do a few more coats that way. And that'll give us a good gloss, but you can see it enhances the wood grain, gives us a nice little bit of gloss and chatoyancy to the piece as well. So we'll let this tack up and then we'll take it outside. All right, so we're back in here. We've got our table set up. The finish on our hat is nice and cured. Now we're ready to glue on the little insert piece. So what we'll do is I've got some Glue Boost. This is the Fill and Finish Original. This is basically a thick CA glue. And I'll put just a tiny little drop right here on the hat itself. And then I'll spray some activator on the insert. That way I can just lay this onto the hat. And I'm just going to hold this here for a few seconds while that cures. I'll spray a little extra activator just to make sure I get in there and everything's cured. And the hat is done. I think the hat looks pretty cool. I like that little miner's helmet with the light on it. It looks pretty sweet. And now what we need to do is we'll set this off to the side for just a minute. And it's time to put on the decals on our face. We offer a couple different decal packs you can get. These things add a lot of character to these little Lego heads. So I think with the miner's hat, I think I'm going to go with the bearded guy. So I'll cut this out, and it has a transfer tape on there so we can peel this all off and then lay it on there, and it goes on really easy. So we'll just get our scissors and just cut out the face you want. And then we'll just set this aside for some other heads we're going to turn. And I like to lay the face down, and I think having this little wormhole, I'll have that kind of off to the side, like a little miner's injury or something there. And then what we want to do is we'll just peel the transfer tape off, and the decals will lift off with it. We can take the backer, set that off to the side, and then we'll just center this as best we can on our face, making sure it's nice and level, and then we'll just lay that down on the surface. You want to make sure that your spray paint is nice and fully cured before you do this. That way the transfer tape doesn't peel some of the paint off. But we just want to rub down that decal, make sure it's fully adhered. Especially on the ends of the beards and the eyebrows. Those are the parts that kind of tend to stick to the transfer tape. So we'll just rub that down and then we can peel off our transfer tape. Now we've got a really cool looking face. He's ready for his hat. So let's throw his hat on and see just how it looks. I think that's got a lot of character to it. I think it's a really cool looking project and it's a lot of fun to make, and it's really quick and easy to make as well. Let's go over the different variety of hats and accessories and the faces we have here, and we'll start out with the bowler hat guy. So this one's a really fun one. The hat turns basically the exact same way as we did on the miner's hat. I just spray painted it black, added a nice little decorative line, and I think that one looks pretty cool. This one's probably one of my favorites. This one's a cool little Indiana Jones inspired style one, a little fedora, and I've sanded the brim of the hat to give it a little bit of shape and added some different sanding marks here to give it a little bit better of a hat look. And then I dyed this. This is a piece of ash. I think this one looks pretty cool. This one was a really good one. This one's a cool little kind of space helmet. This one was a little more work to do. This one is a nice piece of figured maple, but cutting this out took a little bit of carving tools and a fair amount of sanding. But the cool thing about this is you can have one face on this side and then you can flip it around depending on how you feel that day. But it's a pretty cool thing. You can switch around. So put a couple faces, one on the front, one on the back, and you can alternate them. This one here, cool little lady face with a lady's hat on there. We can always switch it out for some hair if you wanted to do that. But I think the hat looks pretty good as well. All right, so we got our Lego inspired guys done. It's a super popular project. I know I'm going to be turning a lot of these this year for gifts. Hopefully you guys have fun and experiment with different hats, accessories, faces, and different styles with this project. It's a ton of fun. The great thing about it is you can use a bunch of scrap wood. It doesn't take a lot of money to make this project happen, and it's really easy and quick to turn. So hopefully you guys learned a lot in this video, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. And as always, if you want to watch more wood turning videos, subscribe to our YouTube channel.